The glass door was heavier than I remembered. Or maybe it was just the weight of the bars on my shoulders, the new, stiff fabric of the captain's uniform that made it feel that way. I stood for a moment, my hand on the cool metal handle, staring at my faint reflection. 5 years. It had been 5 years since I'd first walked through this same door, a different person in every conceivable way except for the stubborn set of my jaw. The recruiting station looked exactly the same faint smell of industrial cleaner and stale coffee, the same worn linoleum floor, the same posters on the wall urging patriotism and adventure. Only the faces in the posters had changed. I could see him through the glass just as I knew I would. Master Sergeant David Peck sat behind the central desk, his head bent over a stack of paperwork, his posture radiating the same weary authority it always had. The sight of him sent a jolt through me, a cold splash of memory that was as vivid as the day it happened. I took a slow, steadying breath, the one I'd practiced in the car. This wasn't the time for memories. This was the time for the present. But the past had a way of insisting on its due. The air conditioning was a losing battle against the late summer heat, and the tiny waiting area felt like a humidor. I was 25, my palms damp, clutching a folder that contained my entire life, college transcripts, letters of recommendation, a degree in strategic studies that suddenly felt as flimsy as tissue paper. I'd practiced my speech in the mirror all morning. I want to serve my country. I believe I have the qualities necessary for a commission. I am seeking a challenge. The words sounded hollow and rehearsed even to my own ears. A buzzer sounded, a harsh, abrupt noise that made me jump. "Vance, Master Sergeant will see you now." A young corporal with a bored expression gestured toward an office at the back. I stood, smoothing down the skirt of the conservative, interview-appropriate dress I'd bought for this exact moment. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The office was small, dominated by a large, cluttered desk. And behind the desk was Master Sergeant Peck. He was older than I'd expected, with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen too much of everything. He didn't look up as I entered, finishing a note on a file with a deliberate slowness that felt like a test. "Elena Vance," I said, my voice thankfully steady. "I have an appointment to discuss an officer's commission." He finally looked up, and his eyes swept over me in a single, assessing glance. It wasn't a leer, it was something colder, more clinical, like a butcher sizing up a side of beef. He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit." I sat back straight, hands folded in my lap over the folder. I launched into my prepared speech, the words tumbling out a little too quickly. I talked about my education, my leadership roles in university clubs, my physical fitness scores. He listened, his expression unchanging, occasionally jotting a note on a pad. When I finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the hum of the struggling AC unit. He leaned back in his chair, the old leather creaking in protest. "So, you want to be an officer?" It wasn't a question. "Yes, Master Sergeant." "You think because you read some books and ran a few student government meetings, you can lead soldiers?" His tone was flat, devoid of malice, which somehow made it worse. It was a simple statement of fact, his fact. "I believe I have the foundational qualities that can be developed," I said, choosing my words with care. "I'm willing to work harder than anyone." He gave a short, humorless laugh, a dry bark of sound. "Everyone says that. They all come in here with their degrees and their big dreams. They think it's about being in charge, about the uniform." He picked up my file, flipping through the pages without really seeing them. "Officer material, it's not something you learn. It's something you are, a presence, a bearing." He looked at me again, and this time his gaze felt like a physical weight. It traveled from my sensible shoes to my carefully styled hair, and I felt myself shrinking under it. I could see the calculation in his eyes, the instant, irrevocable judgment. He saw a girl playing soldier. He saw someone who had never gotten her hands dirty, who had never been tested. "You," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more penetrating than a shout. "You don't have it. You lack the right presence. You're too quiet. Officers need to command a room. They need to be heard." The words landed like blows, each one knocking the air from my lungs. Lack the right presence. Too quiet. They were echoes of doubts I'd already harbored, given voice by a man whose opinion carried the weight of authority. And then it came. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, not into a smile, but into something infinitely more condescending. A smirk. It was a small, fleeting expression, there and then gone, but it was seared into my memory with the heat of a brand. It was the smirk of a man who believed he had seen the entirety of my future in a 5-minute conversation and found it wanting. "Frankly, Vance," he said, sliding my folder back across the desk as if it were contaminated, "you'll never make officer." The world narrowed to the grain of the wooden desk, the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Humiliation, hot and sharp, washed over me. I wanted to argue, to list my accomplishments again, to demand a fair chance. But the words wouldn't come. They were trapped behind a wall of shame. His certainty was a fortress, and my resolve felt like a child's wooden sword. I stood up, my legs trembling. I couldn't look at him. I gathered my folder, my movements clumsy. "Thank you for your time, Master Sergeant," I managed to whisper, the words ash in my mouth. I walked out of that office, the smirk burning behind my eyes. The board corporal looked up. "All set." I didn't answer him. I stood in the middle of the recruiting station, the patriotic posters now seeming like mockery. Be all you can be. The irony was a physical pain. Every instinct told me to run, to get outside, to gulp down the humid air and forget this entire humiliating episode. But then I looked at the other desk, the one where the corporal sat. There was another poster there, simpler, less glamorous. It showed a soldier in fatigues, her face smudged with dirt, a look of intense concentration in her eyes. The caption read, "The Army, it starts here." A cold, hard knot of resolve tightened in my stomach. He thought I lacked presence. He thought I was too quiet. He thought I'd never make it. Fine. If the front door was locked, I'd go through the basement. If I couldn't prove him wrong from the outside, I'd do it from the inside. I turned to the corporal, my voice low but clear, all trace of the nervous interviewee gone. "I'd like to enlist." The corporal blinked. "Enlist, but I thought you were here for." "I've changed my mind," I said, cutting him off. "I want to enlist today." The process was a blur of paperwork and medical checks. My hand was steady as I signed my name on the final forms, the pen scratching against the paper with a sound of finality. I was committing to 4 years of my life based on the smirk of a cynical man. It was insane, but the alternative, walking away, admitting he was right, was unthinkable. That smirk would have haunted me forever. Now, it would fuel me. As I finished, a man approached the desk. He was tall and lean, with a calm, observant face and the stripes of a sergeant on his sleeve. He had been watching me from a distance during the latter part of the process. "Elena Vance?" he asked, his voice even and surprisingly gentle. "Yes, Sergeant." "I'm Sergeant Thorne, Marcus Thorne. I'll be your squad leader at basic training. Welcome." He offered a small, genuine smile, a stark contrast to the expression that was now etched into my psyche. His eyes, a warm shade of brown, held no judgment, only a quiet assessment. He glanced down at my file, then back at me. "Saw you go in to see the Master Sergeant. Decided to take a different path." I met his gaze, my own hardening. Something like that. He nodded slowly, as if he understood far more than I was saying. He'd probably seen this scenario before, hopeful officer candidates getting shot down by Peck. "The path doesn't matter nearly as much as the person walking it," he said. "The Army needs good people, Vance, in the ranks and in the officer corps. Sometimes it's good to see things from the ground up." His words weren't effusive praise or empty encouragement. They were simple, practical, and they felt like a lifeline. He saw potential, not a failure. In that moment, Sergeant Marcus Thorne became the first person in this new life who made me feel like I hadn't just made the biggest mistake of my life. "Thank you, Sergeant," I said, and for the first time since I'd walked into Peck's office, I meant it. "Get your things. I'll give you a ride to the MEPS station. Your bus leaves tonight." He turned to lead the way, and I picked up my small bag. As I followed him, I couldn't resist one last look back. Master Sergeant Peck was standing in the doorway of his office, watching us go. He caught my eye. There was no smirk now, just a bland, indifferent expression, the look of a man who had already forgotten me, just another kid he'd processed and filed away. He gave a slight, dismissive nod to Thorne and turned back into his office. The door closed behind him with a soft click. That was it. The end of one life and the beginning of another. I turned my back on the recruiting station and followed Sergeant Thorne out into the afternoon sun, the ghost of that smirk a cold fire in my heart, and the steady presence of my new squad leader a small, warm ember of hope. I was a soldier now, and I had everything to prove. The smell of damp earth and diesel fuel filled my lungs, a familiar perfume after 3 years. Cold rain misted my face, plastering stray strands of hair to my temples, but I barely felt it. My focus was on the map in my hands, the laminated surface beaded with water, and on the 4 soldiers waiting for my order. "Chen, status on the relay," I asked, my voice calm, cutting through the steady patter of rain on the treetops. Corporal Liam Chen, crouched beside a gnarled oak, didn't look up from his equipment. "Signal is strong, Sergeant Vance. Comms are live. They're waiting on your go." A flicker of a smile touched my lips. "Sergeant." The rank still felt new, a solid weight on my shoulders that I'd grown into. It had been 3 years since I'd walked out of Master Sergeant Peck's office, my pride stinging but my resolve hardening into something unbreakable. The army had sanded down my sharp edges, replacing nervous energy with a quiet, steady burn. I'd learned to fix a jammed rifle in the dark, to navigate by the stars when GPS failed, to read the exhaustion in a soldier's eyes before they admitted it. I'd earned this rank not through any grand heroics, but through the daily grind of being competent, of being reliable. Today was different, though. Today was a test I'd designed myself. A field training exercise for my squad, a complex problem that required more than just following a checklist. It required initiative. "Thorne gave us a tight window," said a voice beside me. "Private Miller, a good soldier but prone to anxiety. Are we moving?" I folded the map, the crinkle of plastic loud in the damp air. "We're moving, but not the way they expect. Chen, patch me through to the OPFOR observers." Chen's eyebrows shot up, but his hands moved swiftly over the radio. "Patching now, Sergeant." A crackle, then a bored voice. "Observer Actual, go ahead." "Observer Actual, this is Sergeant Vance, Blue Team. We are executing a deviation from planned route Alpha, proceeding on foot via the eastern creek bed. Acknowledge." Silence for a moment, then a grunt. "Acknowledged, Blue Team. That's unorthodox, you're burning daylight." "Understood." I clicked off, meeting the questioning looks from my squad. The creek bed was steep, muddy, and added a kilometer to the route. It was also the last place the opposing force would expect us. "They've got the main trails locked down," I explained, my voice low. "This way, we hit the objective from the blind side. It'll be harder, but it's our best shot. Chen, you're on point. Miller, watch our 6. Let's move." I led the way, sliding down the embankment into the shallow, icy water. The move was a gamble. If I was wrong, we'd fail the exercise and the critique would be brutal. But if I was right, it was more than just winning a training scenario. It was about proving a concept, one that had been simmering in my mind for months. Leadership wasn't just about following orders. It was about knowing when the map was wrong and having the courage to draw a new one. The creek bed was a slog, our boots sinking into the muck. The rain picked up, sheeting down through the bare branches. For an hour, we pushed forward in silence, save for the squelch of mud and the sound of our own breathing. I could feel the doubt radiating from Miller, but Chen moved with a determined focus, his eyes constantly scanning ahead. Then we saw it, the simulated ammunition depot, our objective, barely visible through the trees. And just as I'd predicted, the defense was concentrated on the western approaches. The eastern side was virtually empty. I signaled a halt, gesturing for the team to gather. "All right, Chen, you and Davis set up the charge simulators here and here." I pointed to 2 spots on my crude sketch in the mud. "Create a diversion. Miller, you're with me. We go in the moment their attention shifts." The execution was flawless. The loud crump of the simulators drew the defenders away like moths to a flame. Miller and I slipped through the perimeter, planting the final device on the depot's main hatch. I pressed the timer, and a bright orange flag popped up, signaling a successful breach. Back at the debrief, the OPFOR commander, a grizzled staff sergeant, shook his head, a grudging respect in his eyes. "Hell of a gamble, Vance. No one ever goes through the creek. It's a mess." "The enemy expects us to take the path of least resistance, Sergeant," I said, wiping mud from my face. "Sometimes the harder path is the clearer one." Later, as we were cleaning our gear in the motor pool, the smell of grease and solvent replacing the scent of the field, Chen approached me. "That was brilliant, Sarge, I mean it. I would have just followed the route card." "You would have gotten shot, is what you would have done," I said, but I smiled. Chen's enthusiasm was infectious. He was young, sharp, and saw the army not as a job, but as a puzzle to be solved. In many ways, he reminded me of myself, minus the weight of something to prove. "It's more than that, though, isn't it?" he pressed, his voice dropping. "It's about seeing the whole board. That's officer-level thinking." The word hung in the air between us. Officer. It was a thought I had disciplined myself to keep buried, a quiet, persistent ember I was afraid to fan into a flame. I'd found a home in the enlisted ranks. I was good at my job, respected by my peers. Was it arrogance to want more? I found my answer later that evening, sitting across from Sergeant Marcus Thorne in the chow hall. The room was a cacophony of clattering trays and shouted conversations, but at our small table, it felt like an island of calm. Thorne had been my anchor since basic training, the mentor who saw past my quiet exterior to the drive underneath. He'd guided me through my first promotion, defended me against cynical old-timers who thought a woman with a degree didn't belong in the field, and had become a true friend. I told him about the exercise, about Chen's comment. I didn't mention the deeper ambition, letting the story speak for itself. Thorne listened, sipping his coffee, his gaze steady. When I finished, he set his mug down with a soft thud. "Chen's right, you know. What you did today, that's instinct. You can't teach that. Most lieutenants I've known would have gotten their whole platoon waxed following the book." "It was just a training exercise," I demurred, pushing a pea around my plate with my fork. "No, Alina, it was." He leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "You've hit your stride here. You're one of the best NCOs in the company, but you've got a ceiling. We all do. The Army needs thinkers like you making bigger decisions." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Have you thought any more about OCS?" The ember glowed brighter. I looked up from my plate, meeting his eyes. "Every day." "Then it's time," he said simply. "Let's get your packet together. I'll write the NCO support letter. It'll be the easiest letter I've ever written." The following weeks were a whirlwind of quiet diligence. After duty hours, my time was consumed by the mountain of paperwork required for an officer candidate school application. Thorne was true to his word, guiding me through every form, every essay question. He helped me articulate the lessons from exercises like the creek bed assault, framing them not as acts of rebellion, but as examples of adaptive leadership. We worked late into the nights, the hum of the fluorescent lights in the empty office our only companion. It felt like a conspiracy of hope, a secret project that filled me with a nervous, thrilling energy. Finally, the day came. The packet was complete, a thick, satisfying stack of paper that represented countless hours of work and a fragile dream. My hands were steady as I carried it to the company headquarters building, Thorne walking beside me, a silent pillar of support. The administrative clerk took the packet with a nod. "It'll need the station commander's endorsement before it goes to Battalion Sergeant Vance. I'll get it to Master Sergeant Peck's inbox." A cold trickle of apprehension ran down my spine. Peck. I hadn't spoken to him beyond perfunctory greetings in 3 years. He was a fixture, a permanent, cynical monument in the recruiting station, his career seemingly stalled at that very desk. I'd seen his smirk directed at other new recruits, heard his weary sighs in staff meetings. The memory of my own interview was a cold stone in my gut, but Thorne's recommendation was golden, my record was spotless. What could he possibly object to? A week passed, then 2. The initial anticipation began to curdle into anxiety. I made excuses to walk past the admin office, my heart jumping every time the phone rang. Thorne told me to be patient, that the Army's wheels turned slowly. The answer came not with a phone call, but with a look. I was inventorying supplies when Thorne found me in the supply room. His face was a carefully neutral mask, but his eyes were hard. "Elena," he said, his voice tight, "Peck wants to see us, both of us now." The walk to his office was the longest of my life. The familiar smell of stale coffee and floor wax in the hallway brought back the visceral memory of being 25, clutching my application, my palms damp with nerves. This time, my palms were dry, but a cold fury was beginning to burn in my chest. Peck's office was unchanged. The same dusty flag, the same faded posters. He sat behind his desk, my OCS packet open in front of him. He didn't look up as we entered, instead making a show of slowly finishing a note on a separate form. The silence was a weapon, and he wielded it expertly. Finally, he looked up, his eyes skipping over me to land on Thorn. "Sergeant Thorn, close the door." Thorn did, then stood beside my chair, a solid, imposing presence. "Sergeant Vance," Peck began, his tone conversational as if discussing the weather. "I've reviewed your packet, it's thorough." "Thank you, Master Sergeant," I said, my voice even. "Your record is commendable. No one disputes your competence as an NCO." He leaned back in his chair, the old leather creaking under his weight. Then he picked up a single sheet of paper, his commander's endorsement. "However, an officer requires more than just competence. They require a certain temperament, a presence." He let the word hang in the air. I could feel Thorn tense beside me. "And what exactly is the issue with Sergeant Vance's temperament?" Thorn's voice was dangerously calm. Peck's lips twitched into that familiar, infuriating smirk. It was weaker now, more strained, but it was there. "It's not an issue, Sergeant. It's an observation, an assessment. Sergeant Vance is a fine soldier, but she's quiet, reserved. I'm not convinced she possesses the forceful leadership qualities, the command presence necessary for a commissioned officer. My endorsement reflects these concerns." He tapped the paper. "It recommends we delay her application, give her more time to develop those skills." The room seemed to shrink. The air grew thick. He wasn't blocking me outright. He was doing something worse. He was smothering me with faint praise and damning doubt, using his authority to validate the very same snapshot judgment he'd made 5 years ago. He still saw the nervous girl, and he was determined to keep her in that chair forever. The cold fury in my chest ignited, but I didn't raise my voice. I leaned forward just slightly, my eyes locked on his. "Master Sergeant Peck," I said, my tone as level as if I were giving a situation report. "With all due respect, my leadership has been evaluated in the field under pressure by my superiors and my subordinates. Sergeant Thorn's recommendation speaks to that. My performance reviews speak to that. I would ask that you consider the empirical evidence of the last 3 years, rather than a subjective impression." The smirk vanished. He hadn't expected a rebuttal. He looked from me to Thorn, whose arms were now crossed over his chest, his expression making it clear whose side he was on. "The empirical evidence is that I am the station commander," Peck said, his voice losing its casual tone and turning sharp. "My endorsement is required, and I have concerns." "Then we'll take those concerns to battalion," Thorn said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Regulation allows Sergeant Vance to submit her packet with a statement of disagreement from the first-line supervisor. That's me. Your lukewarm endorsement can be included, and the battalion board can decide if your subjective impression outweighs a stellar record and a strong NCO recommendation." Peck's face flushed. This was a challenge to his authority, and in front of me, the person whose potential he'd dismissed from day one. He was cornered. He could refuse, and we would appeal anyway, making him look petty, or he could let it go forward and risk being proven wrong. He stared at Thorn for a long, hateful moment, then snatched up his pen. "Fine," he spat. He scrawled a signature at the bottom of the endorsement, the same lukewarm, questioning text now set in ink, and shoved the packet across the desk. "It's your career. Don't come crying to me when you find out you're not cut out for it." The next month was an agony of waiting. Every day was an exercise in maintaining a calm exterior, while my mind raced through every possible outcome. Thorn assured me that a strong packet with a strong NCO rebuttal would almost certainly prevail over a weak commander's dissent, but the doubt Peck had sown was a poisonous weed. What if he was right? What if my quiet determination was just a personality flaw in an officer's world? Then, one Tuesday, the letter came. A thick, official envelope from battalion headquarters mixed in with the routine mail. My hands trembled as I picked it up. I couldn't open it there in the bustling company office. I needed to be alone. I walked quickly to the empty barrack stateroom, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and old vinyl. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I sat on a stiff couch, the envelope heavy in my lap. This was it. This was the moment that would define the next chapter of my life, the moment that would prove whether Peck's cynicism or Thorn's faith was the truer measure of my worth. I took a deep breath, slid my thumb under the flap, and tore it open. I pulled out the single sheet of paper. The heading was formal. The language was dry, bureaucratic, but the words themselves were the most beautiful I had ever read. After review of your application package, pleased to inform you, selected for attendance at Officer Candidate School, Class 824, report to Fort Benning on. I read it once. Then again, the words didn't change. A wave of pure, unadulterated triumph washed over me, so potent it was almost dizzying. I had done it. Despite him, because of him. I had taken his dismissive smirk and used it as fuel for 3 long years, and now I had the paper to prove him wrong. But as the initial euphoria subsided, another feeling crept in, cold and sharp: fear. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning, and a terrifying one. OCS was a crucible designed to break you down. I was leaving the comfort of the enlisted ranks, where I knew the rules, where I had earned my place. I was stepping into a world OF Chinese letter, where the expectations were higher and the scrutiny would be intense. I folded the letter carefully, my fingers tracing the embossed seal of the Department of the Army. The triumph and the anxiety warred within me, a confusing cocktail of emotions. I looked out the window at the parade ground, where new privates were marching under the watchful eyes of their drill sergeants. I was no longer one of them. I was on a path to lead them. The door to the day room creaked open, and Liam Chen poked his head in. "Sergeant Vance, they said you— oh, sorry, are you okay?" I looked up at him, and I knew my face must have been a mosaic of conflicting feelings. I held up the letter. "I'm leaving, Chen." His eyes widened, then a brilliant grin spread across his face. "You got it? You're going to OCS? That's amazing." He stepped fully into the room, his excitement filling the quiet space. "I knew it. I told you that day in the creek bed. Officer material." His unwavering belief was a balm to the sudden chill of my anxiety. In his eyes, I saw the reflection of the leader I hoped to become, not the one Peck had tried to confine me to. The triumph began to outweigh the fear. I had cleared the first, most personal hurdle. The next one awaited. I stood up, squaring my shoulders, the acceptance letter a tangible promise in my hand. The grind had got me this far. It would have to carry me the rest of the way. The rain fell in icy, horizontal sheets, stinging my face as I stood at the head of the chalk-stained concrete square. A sea of identical green ponchos stretched out before me, each hood framing a face set in a mask of stoic endurance or thinly veiled panic. This was the leadership reaction course, the crucible of OCS, and the weight of the simulated platoon on my shoulders felt heavier than any rucksack I'd ever carried. "Candidate Vance, you have 8 minutes to solve the problem." The instructor's voice, amplified by a bullhorn, cut through the drumming rain. "Your element must cross the contaminated zone using only the materials provided and reach the objective. Time starts now." My eyes scanned the scenario. A 20-foot-wide trench, filled with murky water, separated us from a small platform holding a radio, the objective. The materials: 3 wooden planks, 2 short lengths of rope, and a single, flimsy-looking inflatable raft. The problem was classic OCS. Simple in theory, brutally complex under pressure, designed to strip away your rank and reveal the raw leader beneath. "All right, listen up," I began, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. I had to project, to be heard over the rain and the pounding of my own heart. "Chen, check the integrity of that raft. Don't inflate it yet. Williams, measure those planks against the width of the trench." The squad moved, but there was a hesitation, a fraction of a second too long. I saw it in their eyes. They were waiting for a roar, for the kind of booming, charismatic command they saw in the movies. The kind Master Sergeant Peck would have said I lacked. His ghost was here with me, in the freezing New Jersey rain, his smirk a permanent fixture in the back of my mind. 5 years and you still have to force it, Vance," the voice whispered. "Some officer material." I pushed the thought down, deep into the cold pit of my stomach where I stored all his doubts. This wasn't about him. This was about the 12 candidates depending on me to get them across this pit without falling into the fictional chemical agent. "The planks are too short, ma'am," Williams called out, his voice edged with frustration. "Even the longest one is a good 3 feet shy of the other side." The initial plan, a simple bridge, evaporated. The clock was ticking, a loud, metronomic clang from the bullhorn counting down the seconds. 7 minutes. Panic started to bubble at the edges of my team. Suggestions flew, overlapping and contradictory. "We could try to lash the planks together." "The raft won't hold all of us." We should just swim for it. Their voices blurred into a cacophony. This was where I was supposed to crack down, to shout, to impose order through sheer volume. I felt the pressure to become someone else, the loud, dominant leader OCS seemed to worship. But as I looked at their rain-streaked faces, their genuine desire to succeed warring with their fear of failure, I remembered the creek bed from the field exercise 3 years ago. I remembered the trust my squad had placed in me not because I yelled, but because I listened. I took a slow, deliberate breath, the cold air sharp in my lungs. I didn't raise my voice. Everyone, stop. The words were quiet but firm. The chaos subsided. All eyes turned to me. Yelling won't build a bridge. Raise, you're our knots expert. Can we secure 2 planks end to end with this rope to gain the length we need? Raise shook his head. Not with this type of rope, ma'am. It'll slip under weight. Okay, new idea. My mind raced, sifting through the variables. The raft, the planks, the rope. I looked at the trench, then at the platform. We're thinking about this wrong. We don't need to cross the entire distance on a bridge. We need a hybrid solution. We use the raft as a ferry for the materials and the first pair. They get to the other side, secure one end of a plank. We use the combined length from both sides to create a stable crossing. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't hesitant, it was thoughtful. I saw the calculations happening behind their eyes. Nods began to replace looks of confusion. Williams, you and Chen take the first trip. Get the ropes and the shortest plank over. Raise, you're with me, we'll prep the long plank here. The rest of you, get ready to move fast once the bridge is set. The transformation was immediate. The frantic energy channeled into purposeful action. The raft was inflated. Williams and Chen paddled across the sluggish water, their movements clumsy but effective. On the far side, they anchored the short plank. On our side, we braced the long one. It was still a terrifying gap, but it was a gap we could manage. One by one, the team scrambled across, balancing on the narrow wood, hands grabbing for the secured plank on the other side. I was the last to cross, my heart hammering not from fear, but from a fierce, quiet pride. As I stepped onto the objective platform and grabbed the radio, the bullhorn sounded. Time, objective secured, 0 casualties, top marks, candidate Vance. The rain suddenly felt less cold. As we marched back to the barracks, soaked and exhausted, a few of the candidates clapped me on the shoulder. Good call, Vance, someone muttered. I was about to lose it back there. That small acknowledgement meant more than the instructor's praise. It was the validation I had been searching for since I first walked into that recruiting station. It wasn't about being the loudest, it was about being the clearest. It was about seeing the solution everyone else was too panicked to see. Later that evening, after a hot shower that failed to thaw my bones completely, I found a letter from Sergeant Thorne waiting on my bunk. His letters were a lifeline, a connection to the world where leadership felt organic, not like a performance. I tore it open, my fingers still numb. Elena. Heard from a buddy at Bennying that OCS is living up to its reputation. Remember, they're not trying to build the same model of leader in every candidate. They're trying to break the bad habits so the real leader can emerge. Don't try to be the officer you think they want. Be the NCO your soldiers needed. That's the officer the army needs. Keep your head down and your compass true. Marcus. I read the words twice, a lump forming in my throat. Be the NCO your soldiers needed. He understood. He always had. It was the same lesson Major Jenkins had been trying to drill into my head since I'd arrived. My first encounter with Major Sarah Jenkins had been a disaster. It was the 3rd week during a public speaking drill. We had to deliver an impromptu tactical briefing to a panel of instructors. When my turn came, I stood before the maps and charts, my mind a perfect blank. The words from my prepared notes vanished. All I could see was Master Sergeant Peck's face, his dismissive smirk as he told me I'd make a fine clerk. My voice, when it finally came, was thin and reedy, stumbling over terminology I knew cold. I finished to a silence that was worse than any criticism. After the torture was over, Major Jenkins had gestured for me to remain. Candidate Vance, my office, now. I followed her, my boots feeling like lead weights. Her office was Spartan, dominated by a large tactical map on one wall and a bookshelf overflowing with military history and leadership theory. She didn't sit behind her desk. She leaned against it, arms crossed, her gaze analytical but not unkind. That was underwhelming, Vance, she began, her voice even. "Your file says you were a distinguished graduate of your advanced leader course. Your SGT Thorn speaks very highly of your tactical acumen. What happened out there?" I stared at a point on the wall behind her, unable to meet her eyes. "I froze, ma'am." "I can see that. Why?" The truth felt too pathetic to voice. Because a recruiting sergeant from 5 years ago thinks I'm not good enough. Instead, I offered a weaker version. The pressure, all those eyes. Jenkins was silent for a long moment. "Look at me, candidate." I forced my eyes to meet hers. They were a sharp, intelligent gray, and they saw entirely too much. "I've read your evaluations from your enlisted time. Your NCOs consistently note your strength is in planning and team cohesion. You lead from the center, not the front. Is that accurate?" "I suppose so, ma'am." "Then why, in the name of all that is holy, are you trying to mimic Candidate Miller's command style?" Miller was our resident lion, a former college linebacker whose voice could strip paint from a wall. "His method works for him. Your method, the quiet one, the one that actually thinks, works for you. This course isn't about turning you into someone else. It's about refining the leader you already are. You need to stop trying to lead like you think an officer should lead, and start leading like Alina Vance leads." Her words struck a chord so deep it vibrated through my entire being. Lead like yourself. It was the permission I didn't know I needed. From that day forward, Major Jenkins became my most demanding advocate. She pushed me harder than any other instructor, but her criticism was always constructive, aimed at honing my natural abilities, not replacing them. She forced me into leadership roles in academic debates, where my strength was strategy rather than oration, and praised the clarity of my written orders. Under her tutelage, the ghost of Peck's doubt began to shrink from a looming specter to a distant, insignificant memory. The graduation ceremony was held on a parade field baked hard by the summer sun, a world away from the freezing rain of the leadership course. I stood at rigid attention in my new dress uniform, the butter-colored bars of a second lieutenant feeling strangely light on my epaulets, yet carrying the weight of an entire new world of responsibility. The crisp, blue trousers and stiff jacket were a world away from the enlisted greens I'd worn for 5 years. As the commanding general's voice echoed across the field, calling our names, I felt a profound sense of arrival. This wasn't the end of the journey, it was the real beginning. I thought of Thorne's letter, of Jenkins's mentorship, of the candidates I'd led through the contaminated trench. I thought of Corporal Chen and how his eager competence had always brought out the best in me. When my name was called, Second Lieutenant Alina Vance, I took the single, precise step forward, accepted my diploma with a sharp salute and about-faced. The sun was bright in my eyes, but I didn't blink. I scanned the crowd of proud families and stern-faced officers. For a fleeting second, I imagined I saw a familiar, cynical face in the back, but it was just a trick of the light. It didn't matter. He wasn't here. His opinion no longer held any space in this new reality. I was an officer. Not the officer Master Sergeant Peck had predicted, not a carbon copy of the loud, charismatic mold. I was the officer I had built myself to be, quiet, tenacious, and finally, unshakably confident. The crucible had burned away the doubt, leaving behind a core of tempered steel. The journey that began with a smirk in a dusty recruiting station had reached its first true summit, and as I stood there in the blazing sun, I knew the view was only going to get better. The orders landed in my inbox with the softest digital chime, a sound that usually heralded another staff meeting or a request for updated metrics. But the subject line was different. Permanent change of station orders. My heart, a steady drum against my ribs for the past year and a half, skipped into a quicker rhythm. I'd done my time as a platoon leader, then as a company executive officer, learning the intricate dance of leading soldiers in a line unit. I'd earned respect through late nights and early mornings, through knowing my job better than anyone expected me to, through the quiet tenacity that had become my armor. I opened the attachment. The formal language of the military scrolled down the screen. My name, rank, current unit. And then, the next line, "You are hereby directed to proceed and report to." I read the name of the unit twice. It wasn't a combat brigade, or a training battalion, or any of the other postings I'd mentally prepared for. It was the 12th Recruiting Battalion, Charlie Company, Rockford Station. The air left my lungs in a slow, controlled exhale. Rockford. The name was a ghost, a 5-year-old memory that had fueled me through the worst days of basic training, the grueling mental gauntlet of OCS, and the constant pressure of proving myself as a new officer. I leaned back in my government-issue chair, the squeak of its springs loud in the quiet of my small office. Outside my window, a formation of soldiers marched past, their boots hitting the pavement in unison, a sound that normally grounded me. But now, all I could hear was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the echo of a smirk. I allowed myself a single, slow smile. It wasn't a smile of gloating or vengeance. It was the smile of a puzzle piece clicking into place, the final step in a long, arduous journey that had begun in that very station. It was the satisfaction of a promise I'd made to myself in the stifling heat of a Georgia summer, a promise kept not with a shout, but with the silent, inexorable force of competence. The paperwork took weeks to process, the military machine moving with its own peculiar logic. I packed my life into boxes again, said my farewells to the soldiers I'd led, their handshakes firm and their respect earned. Sergeant Thorne, now a platoon sergeant at another post, had called me. "Captain Vance," he'd said, the pride clear in his voice even through the static of a poor connection. "I always knew you'd end up running the place. Just don't forget what it's like to be the new kid." "I don't think I ever could, Marcus," I'd replied, the memory of his steadying presence during my enlisted days a warm touchstone. The drive to Rockford was a trip through time. The same strip malls lined the highway, the same billboards advertising personal injury lawyers and local mattress stores. When I pulled up to the recruiting station, it was like looking at a photograph that had faded slightly with time. The same brick facade, the same flag snapping in the breeze out front. But the cars in the parking lot were different, and the young man nervously straightening his uniform by the door was a new face. Except he wasn't entirely new. He snapped to attention as I stepped out of my car, my captain's bars catching the sun. "Ma'am, Corporal Chen, welcome to Rockford Station." I couldn't help but break protocol just for a second. A genuine laugh escaped me. "Corporal Chen, what in the world are you doing here?" His serious military bearing cracked into a wide, knowing smile. He'd been a fresh-faced private in my first fire team, a kid who could take apart any piece of communications gear and put it back together blindfolded. "Got tasked, ma'am. Recruiting command needs tech-savvy types, or so they tell me. I have to admit, when I saw the name of our new co on the pre-alert, I may have done a little victory dance in the barracks." "I bet you did," I said, returning his smile. The familiarity was a comfort, a touch point in a place thick with old ghosts. "At ease, Liam. It's good to see a friendly face." "You too, Captain. It's really good to see you." His eyes darted meaningfully towards the station's front door. "The sergeant major is inside. He's expecting you." The way he said it conveyed volumes. The station had been running under the command of a senior non-commissioned officer for a few months, and I knew exactly who that was. "I'm sure he is," I said, my voice neutral. I squared my shoulders, the weight of the new rank on my collar both a comfort and a responsibility. "Let's not keep him waiting." The inside of the station was exactly as I remembered, and yet completely different. The same linoleum floor, the same posters of soldiers in heroic poses, the same faint smell of old coffee and floor wax. But now I was walking in not as a hopeful, nervous candidate, but as its commanding officer. The two recruiters at their desks, a man and a woman I didn't recognize, looked up with curious, respectful eyes. They saw the rank, the command presence I had cultivated over years. They didn't see the girl master Sergeant Peck had dismissed. Chen led me to the office in the back. My office. The door was open. The nameplate on the wall beside it was blank, waiting. But through the open door, I could see Master Sergeant David Peck seated behind the desk, talking on the phone. He was older, the lines on his face deeper, the gray at his temples more pronounced. But the set of his jaw, the cynical slouch of his shoulders, it was all the same. He hadn't seen me yet. "Just get the numbers, that's all they care about," he was saying into the receiver, his voice a familiar gravelly monotone. "No, I don't care how you do it. Just make it happen." He hung up without a goodbye and looked up, his eyes passing over Chen and then landing on me. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing, just the bland acknowledgement of a new officer he'd have to brief. Then the recognition dawned. It didn't wash over his face, it slammed into him. His eyes, which had been half-lidded and bored, widened. The lines around his mouth deepened not in a smirk, but in a stunned, slack-jawed silence. He looked from my face to the captain's bars on my chest, to the unit insignia on my shoulder, and back to my face. The color seemed to drain from his complexion, leaving a pale, waxy mask. His own career, I knew, had stalled at the rank of Master Sergeant. This office, this desk, had been the pinnacle of his authority for years. And now I was standing in the doorway to claim it. He stood up, a slow, almost mechanical motion. "Captain," he said, the words sounding foreign and strained in his mouth. "Master Sergeant Peck," I replied, my voice even and calm, betraying none of the thunderous pulse I felt in my own ears. "I trust you've been keeping the seat warm." I stepped past him into the office. It was smaller than I remembered. The same cheap wood-grain desk, the same filing cabinet in the corner. But on the wall was a new map of the recruiting area, and on the desk was a framed photo of Peck with a group of recruits from what looked like a decade ago. I walked around the desk and stood behind the chair. It was still pushed in, warm from his presence. "Corporal Chen, would you give us a moment?" I said, not taking my eyes off Peck. "Yes, ma'am." Chen withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. The click of the latch was deafening. The silence that followed was thick and heavy, a physical presence in the small room. Peck remained standing, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past my shoulder. The smirk that had been his default expression, the weapon he'd used to dismiss me and countless others, was entirely gone. In its place was a profound, humiliated stillness. He was a man who had built his worldview on the certainty of his own judgments, and that foundation had just been vaporized. "I'll need a full status update on all recruiting efforts," I said, breaking the silence with business-like efficiency. "Current contracts, delayed entry pool, the works, and I'll want to meet with each member of the station individually this afternoon to get to know them." "Yes, Captain," he said, his voice low. He finally met my gaze, and in his eyes I saw no anger, no resentment, just a dazed, professional defeat. The battle wasn't fought with words. It was won the moment I walked through that door. "You can have the rest of the morning to compile that data," I said, my tone leaving no room for discussion. It was the voice of an officer who expected her orders to be carried out. "We'll have a full staff meeting at 1300 hours. Dismissed." He gave a short, sharp nod. "Ma'am." He turned and walked out of the office, closing the door behind him with a quiet, precise click. I listened to his footsteps recede across the outer office. Alone, I finally allowed myself to sink into the chair. It groaned under my weight, the same protest it had made 5 years ago. I ran my fingers over the surface of the desk, feeling the nicks and scratches worn into the laminate. This was the same desk I had sat across from, my palms sweating, as Master Sergeant Peck had told me I'd never make it. The same window looked out onto the same parking lot. But I was not the same person. I spent the next hour unpacking a few small items from my bag. A simple brass nameplate that read Captain VVANCE. I placed it on the desk, the letters facing the door. A framed photograph of my OCS graduation, me standing between a beaming Sergeant Thorne and a stern but approving Major Jenkins, my lieutenant's bars shiny on my shoulders. That day felt both a lifetime ago and like yesterday. Finally, I set up the small, worn notebook Major Jenkins had given me after I'd commissioned. "For your first command," she'd said, "remember, the goal isn't to prove him wrong. The goal is to prove yourself right." At 1300 hours precisely, I walked into the small conference room. Peck, Chen, and the 2 other recruiters were seated around the table. The atmosphere was tense, electric with unspoken history. Peck sat stiffly, his notes arranged in a perfect square in front of him. Chen offered a small, encouraging smile. "Good afternoon," I began, taking my seat at the head of the table. "I'm Captain Vance. Some of you may know my history with this station." I didn't look at Peck, but I felt the room's attention shift toward him for a split second before snapping back to me. "That history is irrelevant to how we will operate moving forward. My command philosophy is simple: competence, fairness, and respect. I expect the best from each of you, and you can expect the same from me. We have a mission to accomplish, and we will accomplish it as a team." I looked at each of them in turn, meeting their eyes. When my gaze landed on Peck, he held it for a moment before giving a curt nod. There was no defiance there, only a grim acceptance. "Master Sergeant Peck, you have the floor. Let's start with the quarterly mission projections." The meeting proceeded with a professional rhythm. Peck's briefing was thorough, efficient, and devoid of any of his usual cynical asides. He was a professional soldier, and despite everything, he was good at his job. When he finished, I assigned tasks. Corporal Chen, I want you to lead an analysis of our social media outreach. I've heard you're the expert. Absolutely, ma'am, Chen said, his eagerness a bright spot in the room. Sergeant Mills, you'll coordinate with the local high schools for their career days. Master Sergeant Peck, I said, turning to him, I have a special project for you. He looked up, his expression guarded. The battalion commander is pushing a new initiative for recruiting prior service personnel. It's complex, and it requires someone with extensive knowledge of the regulations and the credibility to speak to experienced soldiers. I'm assigning you as the station lead. I need a comprehensive plan on my desk by next Friday. This is a high-visibility project, and its success will be a direct reflection on this station. I'm counting on you to deliver your best work. It was a crucial assignment, one that carried significant weight. It was also a task that played directly to his strengths. I wasn't sidelining him, I was challenging him. I was treating him with the professional respect he had never afforded me. The fairness was the point. The victory wasn't in demoting him or punishing him, it was in rising so far above his old judgment that I could command him with integrity. He studied me for a long moment, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not gratitude, but a dawning, uncomfortable understanding. She's not here to settle a score, he was realizing. She's here to do the job, and she expects me to do mine. Understood, Captain, he said, his voice firm. I'll get started immediately. After the meeting adjourned and the others filed out, I returned to my office. The late afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, painting stripes of gold across the floor. I stood by the window, watching the traffic flow past on the main road. The nervous excitement I'd felt upon receiving the orders had settled into a deep, profound calm. I looked at the photo on my desk, at the determined young lieutenant standing between her mentors. I thought of the leadership reaction course, of the rain and the panic and the failed planks. I thought of Major Jenkins telling me that leadership wasn't about having all the answers, but about finding a way forward when the first answer fails. I thought of Sergeant Thorne's unwavering belief. My journey back to this office hadn't been about Peck. It had been about me. His dismissive smirk had been the catalyst, the spark, but the fuel had been my own quiet tenacity. The victory was in the person I had become, a leader who could stand in this room, not with arrogance, but with the hard-won confidence that comes from overcoming doubt, both external and internal. Peck's flawed judgment had set me on this path, but it was my own perseverance that had completed it. I had kept the promise to myself. There was no gloating, no triumphant fanfare. Just the quiet hum of the computer, the smell of old coffee, and the solid, unshakable knowledge that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The journey was complete. Now the work could begin.